In 2002, when I was in graduate school, I applied to Dr. Jack Shaheen's scholarship. So he has a scholarship, I think it's $1,000 to support graduate students working in communication and media studies. And I applied to the scholarship and I didn't get it. But I received a handwritten note in the mail from Dr. Jack Shaheen saying that he really wished that he could have awarded it to me, but since I wasn't majoring specifically in media studies and communication studies, I wasn't eligible. And I was so moved. It was a handwritten note. How often do you get a handwritten note in the mail like that? So he came out to San Francisco. I was doing my graduate studies in California, and he came out to San Francisco a few months later, and we met for the first time. So that was in 2002, and then we maintained a close relationship until his passing in 2017. So Jack Shaheen's work, and particularly his book, Real Bad Arabs, How Hollywood Vilifies a People, sets the foundation for anyone who wants to do research or understand the history of representations of Arabs in American cinema. So the book is really incredible, and because in the book he documents over approximately 1,000 Hollywood movies and their representation of Arabs. And I did once ask him if he literally watched 1,000 movies. He said he did. He watched all of them himself. And the book is like an encyclopedia where you can look up a particular movie from A to Z and read his notes on how Arabs have been portrayed. And so the book shows a very long history of Arabs being portrayed either in the early cinema. It starts in 1797 and the book goes until 2000. So in earlier cinema, Arabs being portrayed as exotic, strange beings, Arab men particularly as romantic sheiks, dangerous sheiks, Arab women as belly dancers, harem girls, and dancing girls. And then in later cinema, after 1940s, 50s, 60s, we see the emergence of the images we're very familiar with today, such as the terrorist stereotype and the oppressed veiled woman. So his book really sets the foundation for anyone trying to do this kind of work. And he says that in that book, out of the 1,000 movies, he characterized 52 as even-handed and 12 as positive. So given that base, we can draw the conclusion about tremendous stereotyping throughout the history of Hollywood cinema. A stereotype is reducing a complex group of people to a singular characteristic. What Dr. Jack did was he literally watched every single Hollywood movie. So that particular book goes until 2000, and then he wrote another book called Guilty, Hollywood's Verdict on Arabs After September 11th. And he continues that project where he's literally documenting every single movie. It's a painstaking process, and I think the best way to honor his legacy is to continue that work of analyzing, documenting every single film that comes out of Hollywood, how it's portraying Arabs, and trying to track what the representation is, if there's any change, what that change is. The US government has a Pentagon liaison to Hollywood. So there are times where there is direct collaboration. So if Hollywood is making a film that represents the US military, and if they want to use military jets, for example, or tanks, then they can send a request to the Pentagon for collaboration and advising, and the Pentagon will approve the film only if it portrays the military in an honorable way. So the result of this is not every Hollywood movie uses this particular bureau, but those that do, the government ensures that the military is portrayed in a very honorable way, and as a result, can inspire others to want to join the US military. In American cinema, the bigger issue is that many people say, oh, it's just entertainment. It's not political. Why are you reading politics into it? This is just entertainment. And oftentimes when writers, producers, directors are interviewed, they say the same thing. We're just trying to make interesting stories. It's not a political thing. But entertainment is political. So two examples that come to my mind are the TV drama 24, which was very popular after September 11th. It was on the air for at least 8 seasons. And a controversy emerged around 24's portrayal of torture as an effective means of interrogation. So some military faculty from West Point Academy contacted the writers and producers of 24 and asked them to please stop portraying torture as an effective means of interrogation. And the writers and producers said, we're just creating edge-of-your-seat drama. We're not trying to create a manual. We're not trying to instruct cadets. But the faculty at West Point Academy said that they were having trouble training their cadets who wanted to be heroic, like Jack Bauer, the main character. They were breaking protocol, and they were seeing torture as an effective means of interrogation. And another example that comes to my mind is the film American Sniper, which was very controversial because some viewers, after watching the film, were tweeting that it made them hate Arabs 1,000,000 times more than they did before, and it was inspiring them to join the military specifically to kill Arabs. So we see that cinema is very powerful in shaping how we understand the world, how we understand politics, how we understand different cultures and peoples. So if we think about Jack Shaheen's book and the 1,000 movies and the conclusion of A History of Stereotyping, then when the US government, for example, in 2003, declared a war in Iraq, it wasn't that hard for the government to have at least 50% of the citizens' support, because viewing images of Arabs as violent, terroristic, uncivilized, barbaric, irrational for decades made it very easy for the government to have at least 50% support. So the way I see it is that it's not necessarily that, at least at this point, that the United States is explicitly using Hollywood to produce propaganda, or that filmmakers are intentionally promoting propaganda, but rather this history of filmmaking and the continuation of terrorist-themed films makes it very easy for the government to get support for very repressive policies, invading other countries. And in the case of Iraq, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And many policymakers today agree that it was a mistake. And meanwhile, an entire country was destroyed. Over 100,000 people were killed on a false premise. What also comes to mind with this question is Professor Maniba Salim at the University of Michigan. She's a social psychologist, and she's done some studies on the impact of viewing representations of Arabs as violent. And what she found is that repeated exposure to images of Arabs as violent leads to increased support of repressive policies, US government policies, for example, the Patriot Act, or special registration, or Muslim ban, and also increased support for invading Arab and Muslim countries. So she's actually found a direct correlation, and in her studies she also tested to see if showing neutral or positive representations would make a difference, and she found that showing neutral or positive representations of Arabs decreased support for repressive policies and military intervention that would impact Arabs and Muslims. My own research has been on representations after 9/11, and particularly on the emergence of sympathetic portrayals of Arabs, Muslims, Arab Americans, and Muslim Americans after 9/11. So after 9/11, I was watching television, and I was surprised to see TV shows with a patriotic Arab American character, or with a storyline about an Arab American who was the unjust victim of a hate crime. And I was surprised because, given this very long history of stereotypes, why would there be some positive or sympathetic portrayals of Arabs and Muslims after September 11th? So I started analyzing those particular representations and wondering, is it as good as it seems? So I came up with the term simplified complex representations, try to capture this phenomenon. And the phenomenon is one in which the storyline appears very complex, the character development appears very complex, but when you start systematically analyzing show after show, you can start predicting what's going to happen, which is these two new types of characters that appear very positive. You realize that the patriotic Arab American is very narrow kind of character. So this is a character who was very popular in 24. There was a character, Nadia Yasser, who worked with the counterterrorism unit. And there was another show called Sleeper Cell, which was about an FBI agent, and the lead FBI agent was Muslim going undercover and stopping a terrorist cell. And so in these examples, the good, quote unquote, good Arab or Muslim is patriotic American, and patriotic in the most narrow sense of the term. So someone who's willing to fight and die, give their life for the United States fighting against terrorism. The other type, the victimized, which is significant because it does evoke sympathy from the audience. And in the history of Hollywood filmmaking, audiences have been positioned to celebrate when Arabs are killed because they're the bad guys. So the victim is significant because we get to feel sympathy for the Arab or Muslim character. However, many of these victim stories appeared in larger storylines and narratives that justified their exclusion from civil rights. So many stories, for example, would have audiences feel really terrible that this unjust situation is happening. But at the same time, the logic of the narrative would reveal, well, this is a time of crisis, normal rules don't apply, and so we're really sorry, but Arabs and Muslims just can't have their civil rights and civil liberties at this time. So simplified complex representations tries to capture a phenomenon where there's a storyline about terrorism, and for writers and producers to try to diffuse the stereotype, because there's more awareness today about stereotyping, you throw in a positive character, you throw in a victimized character with the hope that it will diffuse the stereotype and that audiences who are sensitive to stereotyping won't get upset. But ultimately, the failure of these particular good characters is that they exist in storylines about terrorism. So ultimately, we are still understanding Arab identities largely in the context of terrorism, and they're good or bad in the context of terrorism. With the simplified complex representations and the appearance of the patriotic Arab and the victimized Arab American, Muslim American, it appears that representations are changing. But my argument is that it's really more of a facade, that watching these shows, it made me feel good after 9/11. As an Arab American, as a Muslim American, it made me feel better that people cared and that these messages were out there. But at the very same time that these positive portrayals were on television, repressive policies were being passed by the government. So at that time after 9/11, the Patriot Act, special registration, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, Abu Ghraib prison scandal, there were so many repressive policies that were being passed. So the sympathetic portrayals weren't really matching up to the reality of policies and the reality of the impact of government policies on Arab life. In terms of polarizing Arab identity in Hollywood cinema, 1948 and 1967 in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict is a real turning point. And a lot of that is because the stories that are told are very much from a singular perspective, which is an Israeli Zionist perspective at the expense of a Palestinian perspective. So the result is that Palestinians are portrayed as irrational, as violent, and then later on, by default, it's not just Palestinians, but all Arabs get lumped into that kind of category. And it really reveals larger questions about the power of stories in terms of whose story we have the opportunity to identify with, to sympathize with, and there are many opportunities in American cinema to sympathize with Zionist perspective, stories, plight, and a lack of opportunities to identify with Palestinians. So there are some Arab American filmmakers who have produced really important independent films. So for example, Roland Nashef produced a movie called Detroit Unleaded, which is a love story that takes place in a gas station in Detroit between two Arab Americans. And Jackie Saloom produced Slingshot Hip Hop, which is a documentary about hip hop music in Palestine. And there are other independent filmmakers who are working very hard to change the portrayal and challenge the portrayal. They are really up against a lot, given how many representations there are through Hollywood cinema that are so stereotypical, and then we have a handful of independent filmmakers who are really trying to tell diverse stories, show diverse characters, humanize Arabs and Muslims. Unfortunately, we're at that point in history where that is necessary. So I think the work of independent filmmakers is really important. So can you act Arab? Can you act American? Can you act Chinese? So the idea that one can act Arab assumes that one's going to act a stereotype. So I think there's a distinction between the idea of acting an ethnicity or a race or a culture versus embodying a character. So it is the job of an actor to embody a character and everything that forms the identity of a character. So if an actor who's not Arab was portraying an Arab character, then one would think that they would consider their cultural background, their religious background, their economic background, on their familial background in creating a complicated character. So I don't think that it's a matter that non-Arab actors can't play Arab actors, but rather than Arab actors rarely portray Arab actors, and also that many of the available roles are stereotypical. So I do think it's possible for a non-Arab writer, producer, and director to create complicated Arab characters and storylines about Arabs that are not stereotypical. In looking at Hollywood cinema, there's a study that comes out every year from the University of Southern California. Professor Stacy Smith analyzes the year of Hollywood movies, and year after year she shows that most of the leading characters are white males. I think the last study showed 70% of leading characters in Hollywood are white males. So one of the issues is that there are very few roles for Arabs in leading roles. Another problem is that those Arab actors, let's say Tony Shalhoub or Wendy Malick or Rami Malek, rarely portray Arab characters. And then the added dimension is that historically Arab characters have been played by non-Arabs. So the early films like The Sheik, where I'm thinking about The Road to Morocco, Arab women were portrayed as by white women. In The Road to Morocco, interestingly, the evil Arab is played by Anthony Quinn, who's Mexican-American, and he has several titles to his name playing Arabs as a Mexican-American actor. So he was in Lawrence of Arabia, he was in Lion of the Desert, and then fast forward, his son, Francisco Quinn, played an Arab terrorist on the TV drama 24. So that's one example. And with these kinds of examples with Mexican Americans or South Asians playing Arab roles, what's ended up happening is that a particular look has been produced by Hollywood, what an Arab looks like. And when we think about Arabs coming from 22 different countries and skin color spanning every possible shade, there's no particular Arab look, but Hollywood has produced an Arab look that's very confusing. It's a nondescript brown man, which in turn then leads to when the US government starts racially profiling Arabs, people believe that it's possible to racially profile Arabs when it's not, couldn't possibly be a successful endeavor. F. Murray Abraham is another example, and I think, since he's been an actor for a long time, I think he uses F instead of his Arabic name. I'm not sure what it is. Probably helped him get into the industry. So yes, there is a phenomenon that among Arabs, we're like, oh, so-and-so's Arab. Did you know so-and-so's Arab? And getting excited because no one else knows that about that particular actor. I think it says a lot about the cultural and political era that we live in, that they need to downplay their identity in order to pass and play Italian Americans and other kinds of roles. And I know that for some actors, it becomes challenging if the only roles available to them are as terrorist number 1 or 2. I try to avoid the term authenticity because I feel like it can easily lead to another reductive kind of stereotype. What is an authentic Arab? There are so many different types of Arabs. But in terms of trying to look for a non-stereotypical representation, there are a few things that I look for. First, a storyline that's not about terrorism. I don't think that there's fundamentally anything wrong with portraying Arabs as terrorists, but there is something wrong when we don't see them as anything else. So the goal is diverse stories, diverse people. It's not about portraying Arabs only as good, but complex in their humanity, as is done with many other groups. And then one of the things that I've been trying to do with my work is to encourage others to not only think about whether an image is good or bad, but to think about the larger context. So if we look at the many examples of the TV drama 24, where there's a good Arab put in there, well, it's good, what's the problem? And then that ends the conversation. But if we look at the larger storyline and how it's working, we see the Arab is still in this terrorist storyline, and as a result, it doesn't really produce anything different. So something I look for in the analysis is not just is it good or bad, but how is it working? What kind of story is it telling? Is the character multidimensional? We really see some changes in these representations starting in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel, 1967 with the Arab-Israeli War. We start seeing the portrayal of Arabs as terrorists and as violent and irrational, and then that continues with other political moments. For example, the 1973 Arab oil embargo led to the greedy Arab oil sheik stereotype, and then the Iran hostage crisis, 1979, 1980, led to this conflation, Arab, Muslim, Iranian, they're all confused and conflated, we don't know the difference, and it's all really scary. And after that, the next flashpoint is the Gulf War in 1991, and then September 11th. So historically speaking, there have been more stereotypical depictions of Arabs than there have been depictions of Arabs that are humanistic and highlighting humanity. So I would say that Arab identity cannot be reduced to one thing. And then I would say Arab identity encompasses people who identify with the people, cultures, politics of the 22 Arab countries. Film becomes a tool when it supports a government's agenda.